I never imagined that a name whispered in silence for almost 6 decades could still make my heart race. My name is Ruth. I'm 72 years old, and when I was 14, I met the first love of my life, Frank. The boy who made me laugh under the bleachers at school. The one who wrote the note I hid in my journal for 58 years. A name that never left my memory, not even as the years went by, not even as the world changed. While other people got married, built families, started over, I held on to that name, like someone waiting for something that still might happen one day. But time has a way of punishing those who wait too long. And some stories, when they finally come back around, they're no longer what they once seemed to be. Tell me in the comments, what have you waited for? Far too long. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, made to touch the heart, stir old memories, and change the way we look at the past. I was never one to talk much about the past, not because I lacked memories, but because I had too many. I kept them all inside, almost like sacred things, like someone who hides pressed flowers between the pages of a book. At 72, my days revolved around the quiet of the backyard, the wind brushing across the porch, and the conversations only I could hear. But there was one name that never quite disappeared. Frank. I met him when I was just 14. It was between classes, when he shared a slice of apple with me and a clumsy little laugh. From that moment, something inside me shifted, and even though he moved away a few years later, I never let go of that feeling. Not because I didn't have chances, but because I chose not to. While my friends got married, built families, traveled the world, I stayed. I took care of my mother, I taught literature, and I wrote letters I never sent. Letters to Frank, some short, others pages long, all signed with my name and a kind of longing no one else ever understood. The box where I kept those letters stayed tucked away at the top of the closet, hidden behind old quilts and quiet memories. I never said no to anyone out of cruelty, but there was always a gentle reason, a soft, not now, I'm not ready. The truth was, I was waiting for life to do what I didn't have the courage to do, bring Frank back. For years, that hope felt like a thread of light on winter nights. I still remember the day he handed me a note folded into 4 squares. You're different. That's a good thing. It was simple, almost childish, but I read it like it was a prophecy. I tucked it into a blue notebook, which later became a diary. Little by little, Frank stopped being a person and became something else entirely. A memory, a symbol, a reason, a boundary. When I turned 50, I had a chance to see him again. A classmate said he had moved back to town and was staying with his daughter for a while. But I hesitated. I didn't reach out. I told myself it wasn't the right time. And I kept going, slow steps, tight heart. The years passed like pages flipping too fast. And then, without warning, an envelope arrived at my door. Inside, an invitation, a reunion of former students from our old school. I almost laughed at the coincidence, but the laugh didn't last. My chest tightened in a way I knew too well. One name wasn't on the list, but it was louder than all the others, Frank Collins. I left the invitation on the table and stared at it for days. Every morning, I thought about throwing it out. Every night, I thought about going. Life, once soft and predictable, suddenly felt stirred up. A kind of nervousness I hadn't felt since girlhood, as if I were still that teenager with a pleated skirt and hopeful eyes. One warm, windy afternoon, I stepped up onto the wooden stool in my closet and took down the box. The letters were all still there, and with them, the original note. The paper was yellowed now, but still whole. I read it again, like someone looking at an old photo. You're different. That's a good thing. I took a deep breath. My hands were trembling slightly. That night, I dreamed of him. He looked just like he did at 15, smiling, confident, with the same dimple in his cheek. We were dancing in the school courtyard, without music, just breathing. When I woke, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, unsure if it had been a dream or a memory. That was the day I decided to go. Not because I expected to find love again, but because I needed to finally close a chapter I had never truly read to the end. It was time to give closure, or a beginning, to the life I never lived. So I got ready. I chose a light-colored dress, simple but lovely. I pinned my hair back with care, and I brought the note. I didn't know yet if I would show it, but I knew I couldn't leave it behind. The reunion was being held in an old school building, now repurposed, with wide windows and the smell of old wood mixed with cheap perfume. I arrived early, like I always do. I like watching things before they begin. I sat on a bench near the wall, listening to distant conversations, muffled laughter, voices that felt like they belonged to another lifetime. Time had clearly run its course for everyone, except, somehow, for me. Some had white hair, others had no hair at all. Most had forgotten each other's names, but pretended to remember the smiles. I just watched. And then, at the doorway, he walked in. Frank Collins, thinning hair, reading glasses hanging from the collar of his shirt, steady but slightly dragging steps. He greeted people with a polite smile, like someone who didn't quite remember, but didn't want to be rude. My stomach turned. Was this the man I had loved all my life? He didn't notice me right away. He was surrounded by old classmates who seemed to remember him better than he remembered them. I stayed in my seat. I breathed slowly. For a few minutes I considered leaving before anyone saw me, but then, as if he sensed my gaze, Frank turned and looked right at me. For a moment, our eyes met. There was no spark, no recognition, just a polite curiosity. He walked over, smiling faintly. "Good evening. You look familiar. Can you help me remember your name?" My chest sank, but I answered clearly. "Ruth. Ruth Anderson." He frowned a little. "Ruth. Oh, right. You were in the literature group, weren't you?" I nodded. Frank smiled. "I remember you were quiet, always had a book." I smiled back, barely. It hurt more than I expected. He didn't remember anything, not the note, not the laughs under the bleachers, not the summer he promised to write, and never did. We talked for a few minutes, in that light, polite way strangers do when they pretend to share a past. He told me he'd been married twice, had 3 kids, and now lived with one of his daughters since his last knee surgery. I listened quietly, and inside, something was beginning to unravel, like an old thread finally snapping loose. Frank wasn't unkind, but he wasn't the Frank I had kept. He no longer had the warmth I remembered, or the curiosity, or the way he used to look at me. He was just a man now, with vague memories and tired laughs. And suddenly I realized, maybe he had never been who I thought he was. Before I left, I thought about showing him the note, taking it out of my purse and saying, "You gave me this when we were kids." But I didn't. Maybe I didn't have the courage. Or maybe, just maybe, I had found wisdom. I put the note back in my bag, along with all the years I had spent believing in it. As we said goodbye, Frank said, "It was nice seeing you again, Ruth. I wish you all the best." I smiled gently. "Thank you, Frank. Same to you." Then I turned and walked out of the building without looking back. Not because I was sad, but because something inside me had finally come to an end. Outside, the night breeze brushed against my face. I lifted my head and let the air touch my skin with a softness I hadn't felt in years, and it felt like something was finally settling back into place. The morning after the reunion, I woke up with puffy eyes, though I hadn't cried. There were no tears, just a new kind of silence, one that filled every corner of the house, the kind that doesn't hurt, but doesn't comfort either. I got up slowly, drank my coffee in quiet, and stared at the note on the kitchen table. I didn't know if I should throw it away or keep it. I just sat and looked at it. It was strange to realize that the piece of paper I had protected for decades now felt empty. Not because the words had lost their meaning, but because I could finally see who Frank really was and who I had been in relation to him. An echo, a hope built on memories that maybe were never as real as I believed. That entire day, I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't call Marion or the few friends I trusted enough to hear me. I preferred the sound of the kettle on the stove, the scrape of a chair being pulled out, the rhythm of my own steps on the floor. All of it felt more reliable than any human voice. In the afternoon, I went to the bedroom and took out the box of letters one more time. I opened it, read a few. Others I just flipped through. It felt like reading a diary written by someone else. The girl of 14, the woman at 30, the one at 50. They were all there, writing to a man who never knew they existed. Or worse, who knew and never cared. That's when I stood up, grabbed a random envelope, and picked out just one letter, the one I wrote the day I found out he had returned to town. I read it aloud, my voice trembling, like I needed to witness what had once been dreamed there. When I finished, I didn't rip it up. I didn't put it back. I just left it on the table, next to the old note. Like I was saying, I don't need this anymore. Later that afternoon, I went out into the garden. I hadn't really looked at the flowers in a while. The rose bush had grown tall, a little dry. Yellowed leaves lay scattered on the ground. And even so, there was beauty. Because some things only bloom once we stop waiting too hard. I knelt in the dirt and started cutting back the dead branches, trimming the excess, like clearing space inside myself. That night, instead of watching TV like I usually did, I sat in my armchair with a brand new notebook in my lap. I didn't want to write about what had happened. I wanted to write something different. For the first time, I began a letter to myself. Dear Ruth, I wrote, and stopped, because I didn't know how to go on. It was hard to speak to someone who had been left waiting for so long. I sat there, holding the pen, heart thudding. Then I decided not to write anything else, not that day. I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and went to bed earlier than usual, not out of tiredness, but out of lightness. The same lightness that comes when you finally let go of something you've been carrying your whole life. Sleep came easily, and with it, a different kind of dream. Frank wasn't in it. There were no school hallways, no notes, just a red bicycle leaning against a fence, and the sound of someone laughing in the distance. I woke up with that sound still in my chest, and for the first time in many years, I laughed to myself, without even knowing why. It was as if the past, somehow, had said goodbye in silence, and I was ready to let it go. In the days that followed, I started reorganizing the house. Not because I was sad, but because something inside me said it was time to make space. I cleared out drawers full of old papers, gave away clothes I hadn't worn in decades, boxed up objects that no longer made sense. And in doing so, it felt like I was rediscovering forgotten pieces of myself. At the bottom of a box, I found one earring I used to wear when I was young. Just one. The pair had been lost long ago. But when I put it on, I laughed to myself. "Still fits," I whispered. It wasn't about vanity. It was about rediscovery. I started going out for short walks around the block. I noticed the trees, the neighbors' dogs, and a tall man in a hat who always greeted me with a shy wave. Marion called a few days later, wanting to know how the reunion went. I told her calmly that I saw Frank, but gave no details. Marion, with her usual kindness, understood everything without needing to ask. "Sometimes," she said, "we love the version of someone we carry in our minds more than who they really were." I smiled. "I know, and maybe that's more common than we think." That weekend, I visited the old school. I didn't tell anyone. I just went. The building had changed, new gates, higher walls, but the old tree near the library was still there. I laid my hand on the trunk like I was greeting an old friend. I stood there a while, breathing deeply, letting life settle around me. When I got home, I did something unexpected. I turned on the radio, played a song from my youth, and I danced. Alone, in the middle of the living room, not out of sadness, but with a quiet kind of joy, like I was finally listening to myself after years of silence. After dancing, I picked up the notebook. "Dear Ruth," I began again. "You waited too long for someone who never came, and somewhere in all that, you forgot to wait for yourself. But today, you came back." When I finished, I didn't cry. I simply closed the notebook with the sense that I'd done something big. Later that day, I lit a candle in the backyard. I looked up at the darkening sky and whispered, "Thank you for leaving, Frank. Now, I can stay." And I did, whole. For the first time in years, I belonged to myself. In the back of the nightstand drawer, between old receipts and loose buttons, I found the other earring, the one I thought had been gone for decades. It was tucked inside a little plastic box, like it had been waiting for the right time to show up again. I smiled to myself, not because of the object, but because of what it meant. It felt like something inside me was finally coming full circle. I put the earrings on and looked at myself in the mirror. For a moment, I saw a version of me I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't about vanity. It was about recognition. The woman who had spent her life waiting now looked at herself with eyes that finally saw her. The lines on my face were still there, but so was the light. That day, I did something I hadn't done in ages. I went downtown to the old bookstore I used to visit in my youth. The smell was the same: paper, coffee, aged wood. I walked slowly through the aisles until I found a familiar title, "The Unbearable Lightness of Being." I ran my fingers over the spine like greeting an old friend. The boy at the counter greeted me kindly. He was probably half my age, but he had a gentle curiosity about him. "Do you like to read?" he asked. I smiled. "I've been reading since I learned how to spell, and I never stopped." He smiled back. "You have a calm energy about you." I thanked him and walked out of the shop feeling like I had reopened a door I should never have closed. On the way home, I stopped at a cafe I used to think was too loud. But that day, the sound of people talking and spoons clinking felt like music. I ordered apple cinnamon tea and sat near the window. I watched people come and go. No one knew me there. And oddly, that made me feel more present than I had in years. A woman at the next table made a comment about the weather. I smiled and answered. Soon we were talking about recipes, books, and old memories. Her name was Elaine. She was widowed, full of funny stories, and laughed loudly. I found myself laughing with her, a loose, unguarded laugh. When we said goodbye, I told her, "It was nice talking to you." And she replied, We should do this more often. When I got home, I didn't feel alone. For the first time in a long time, the silence of my house felt warm, not empty. I sat in my chair, opened my notebook, and wrote. Today, I was seen, and I saw myself, others, the world, and everything felt new. I'd always thought that blue vase looked out of place in my home. I'd received it years ago from a coworker and kept it mostly out of politeness. But that morning, I decided to fill it with fresh flowers and place it on the windowsill. It was as if, slowly, I wanted to show the world that life still lived here, even if no one was watching. Little by little, the house began to change. The pillows on the couch, the colorful dishes I used to save for guests became part of my breakfast routine. I realized that I had spent so long waiting for someone else, I had forgotten to let myself enjoy the details of simply being. That Sunday afternoon, I went to the town square. I brought a book, but didn't read it. I just watched. Couples walking, kids running, old men feeding pigeons. It was a quiet spectacle of ordinary life, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged in it, not as an observer, but as someone who had returned to the stage. A little boy came up to me selling flowers. "They're from my grandma's garden," he said proudly. I bought one, a single daisy. When I got home, I placed it in that same blue vase. I smiled. It was just a flower, but it felt like a marker, a quiet symbol of something blooming inside me. In the following days, I started writing more often, not letters to Frank, but loose thoughts, old memories, unasked questions. It felt like digging into myself and discovering there was more space than I'd ever imagined. One afternoon, I wrote a sentence and marked it with a bright ribbon. Waiting didn't kill me, but living is bringing me back to life. And that evening, sitting by the window with a warm cup of tea and sunlight on my shoulders, I felt a quiet certainty. It's not too late, not to begin again, not to know myself, not to love myself. That morning, I opened the old box of letters for the last time. There was something I needed to do, not out of anger, but out of closure. With steady hands, I sorted through every letter I had ever written to Frank. I read just the parts that still echoed somewhere inside me. If you ever come back, I miss you without ever really having you. I still remember your laugh. Each line was like a frame around something that no longer existed, or maybe never had. I took a pair of scissors, sat at the kitchen table, and slowly cut out just the pieces that still belonged to me, my way of loving, my voice, my courage. The rest, I let go. I placed the scraps of paper in a glass bowl, lit a small candle, opened the living room window and let the breeze in, and then, one by one, I burned the pieces gently. It wasn't an act of rage, it was a ritual of release. As the ashes floated upward, I whispered, "You mattered, but I am whole." When I blew out the candle with damp fingers and watched the smoke fade, I didn't feel empty. I felt lighter, like I had made room inside myself, not for another love, necessarily, but for the parts of me I had never claimed. I got dressed, grabbed a small purse, put on a soft lipstick, wore my earrings, and looked in the mirror. "Today I go as Ruth," I whispered, without waiting to be noticed. I walked to the cafe down the street and saw Elaine again, the warm, chatty woman from the other day. We sat together, we laughed, we talked about recipes, and that one neighbor who wore pajamas out in public. I laughed in a way I hadn't in years, easy, open, real. On the way back home, I passed by a paint store. I walked in on impulse, picked out a color called soft almond. The woman behind the counter smiled. "What are you painting?" And I answered without thinking, "An old wall that became invisible." And I knew. I wasn't just talking about the wall. The next morning, I laid out old newspapers on the living room floor, tied a scarf around my hair, and opened the paint can. The smell filled the air like a quiet announcement of change. With the roller in hand and a deep breath in my chest, I started in the corners, always the hardest to reach, always the most forgotten. Each stroke of paint felt like it was washing away bits of silence I'd carried for too long. The wall, once dull, now came to life in soft tones. I painted slowly, with an old playlist playing from the radio. When Blue Moon started to play, I paused and smiled. That song had once inspired a letter I never sent, and now it was soundtracking a moment that finally belonged to me. When I finished, I sat on the floor, hands stained with color, sweat on my back, and I laughed, really laughed, like someone who had just done something they didn't even know they needed to do. The sun poured in through the window, lighting up the freshly painted wall as if to say, "There, that's more like it." I took a picture. For the first time in years, I photographed something I had made, just for me. I sent it to Marion with a message. "Started with the wall. I think the rest will follow." She sent back a heart and a little paintbrush emoji. I smiled. That afternoon, I baked a simple orange cake and left it on the windowsill to cool. The smell filled the house, blending with the scent of new paint. And for the first time, I wanted someone to come in. Not because I was lonely, but because I had something warm to offer. Later, I wrote in my notebook, "Little by little, I'm realizing I'm good company, and maybe that's all I ever needed." That night, I went to bed early. The window was open. A breeze came through, carrying a faint tune from a neighbor's house. I closed my eyes, peaceful. There was no room left for ghosts, no more space for waiting. There was room now. For now. I'd been noticing him for weeks, though we'd never spoken. A tall man, thin, with slow steps, and a shirt always tucked neatly into his pants. Every day, at the same time, he walked past my house with a little white dog that looked like a restless puff of snow. He was quiet, but always greeted me with a gentle, almost shy smile. I returned the gesture, just as gently. That morning, I was watering the flowers when I saw him again. He stopped at the gate, like someone gathering courage to start a conversation. "Do you like daisies?" he asked, nodding toward the flower bed I had recently repainted. I nodded. "They have a simple way of existing, like they don't need to draw attention to be beautiful." He smiled. "My name is Walter. I live on the corner, and this little creature is Max." I looked down at the dog, who seemed to be evaluating whether or not I deserved a bark. "Nice to meet you, Walter. I'm Ruth." The conversation was short, but comfortable, like a warm cup of tea in your hands. In the days that followed, our paths crossed more often. Sometimes he'd walk by and comment on the weather. Sometimes I'd time my errands to bump into him. We talked about the neighborhood, the corner store, and how the older folks still preferred going to the bank in person. Nothing deep, but there was beauty in that simplicity. One day, Walter showed up with a small succulent in a pot. "To go with your daisies," he said. I accepted the gift with a wide smile. "Thank you. She'll sit right next to the blue vase." Noticing the reference, Walter raised an eyebrow. "New paint?" I nodded. New color, new life. Max already behaved like he'd known me for years, sniffing the flowers, napping in the shade of the gate, wagging his tail lazily. I even started saving little pieces of whole wheat bread for him. Just a small gesture, but full of care. That week, I wrote in my notebook, "Not every presence has to arrive with promises. Some come with silence, a slow smile, and tiny dog steps, and still, they fill the room. Marion arrived with a bag full of bread and that same loud laugh she always had. I had to come see this almond-colored wall with my own eyes. I welcomed her in with joy. It was good to have someone who knew my story, but never tied me to it. Marion was like that. She listened to the past, but always spoke of the future. We had coffee on the porch, barefoot, the sun brushing our ankles. Marion talked about a new neighbor who sings too loud, a miracle cream that promised to erase wrinkles, and a documentary that made her cry alone in her kitchen. I laughed with her, freely, and watched her with deep affection. Marion had always been brave. She never waited for anyone. "And Frank?" she asked, like she was asking about the weather. I shrugged, no bitterness in my voice. "He's an old memory, the kind you keep in the back of the drawer, pretty, but no longer useful." Marion nodded. "You seem different." I smiled. "I am. I'm here now." We spent the afternoon that way, one crocheting, the other reading passages from Clarice Lispector. At one point, I closed the book and said, "You know what amazes me most?" Marion looked up. "What?" "That it's not the time I lost waiting. It's how much life is still left, even after all that." Marion reached across the table and held my hand. "I'm so glad you came back." I squeezed her hand gently. "I'm so glad it's not too late." Later, after she left, I stood at the doorway watching the empty street for a moment. I felt a kind of longing, not for Frank, but for the woman I'd left behind for so long. And now, finding her again felt like finding a sister who got lost in childhood. That night, before bed, I wrote, "Today, I looked in the mirror and recognized myself. Maybe that's the most beautiful part of being alive." I woke up with sunlight in the room and a calm in my chest that felt new, like something that used to weigh me down had finally dissolved. I got up slowly, made my coffee, and the very first thing I did was open the living room window wide. I wanted the day to come in, completely, no filters, no fear. That morning, I did something I had never done before. I painted my nails. I picked a shade somewhere between coral and wine, soft but bold. I sat on the porch, polish in hand, brushing layer over layer like planting something onto myself. The result wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Walter passed by later with Max. When he saw me, he stopped at the gate and said, "I think I see some new color around here." I laughed. "Yeah, I think it's finally showing." He didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough, and that was more than I could have asked for. For lunch, I made my mother's old lasagna recipe.
One I hadn't made in years, because I used to say, "It's too much work for just me." But now I knew. I deserved things that took time, that fed me, that cared for me. I set an extra plate at the table, not because I was expecting anyone, but to remind myself there's always room for something new. I looked at that empty place, and instead of sadness, I felt grateful. Grateful to still be here. Grateful to have chosen to stay. Later, I called Elaine. I invited her over for coffee later that week. There'll be orange cake and an almond-colored wall. She laughed on the other end. "If you're there, I'm coming." I smiled, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like life was becoming a space of real exchange, not just memory. That afternoon, I flipped through my old notebooks. I read a few pages and saw how much I had changed. I used to write to fill in the emptiness. Now, I wrote to celebrate presence. Even loneliness felt different, less heavy, more alive, more whole. Before going to bed, I wrote in big letters, "Today, I chose to care for myself." and it was the best choice I've ever made. It had been weeks since I last opened the old memory box, the one filled with old notes, pictures, scribbled thoughts, and things from a life that waited. But that morning, something inside me whispered that it was time, not to forget, but to say thank you. I sat on the living room floor with the box in my lap. One by one, I pulled everything out. A black and white photo from my teenage years, a brooch I used to wear when I started teaching, an envelope with my mother's handwriting, and finally, Frank's old note, the one that had survived all the decades. I read it one more time, not with longing, but with tenderness. You are different. That's a good thing. I smiled. Yes, I was, and I still am. I folded the paper gently, but this time I didn't put it back in the box. I slipped it into a new envelope and wrote on the front, "Remembering is not the same as reliving." I tucked it in with the important things, just not the essential ones. Then I took out the brooch and pinned it to my blouse. It felt like a hug, a quiet reminder that I come from a line of strong women, even when silent. And now it was my turn, not just to exist, but to live with intention. Later, I organized everything into smaller boxes, each item in its place. This new life didn't require forgetting the old one. It only asked that I didn't carry it all at once. By sunset, I made a cup of tea and sat in the garden. The daisies were beginning to open. The blue vase caught the light, and there, among flowers and silence, I closed my eyes. I breathed in, and I smiled. I was alive, present, and more than anything, whole.
That afternoon, I sat in my rocking chair near the window with my notebook in my lap. The sunlight came in sideways, painting golden stripes across the wooden floor. There was something sacred about that moment. Silence, warm tea, paper, and a memory that was still alive. I flipped through the previous pages and smiled. I never imagined I'd be able to write so much about myself. I started a new entry with the date, but instead of writing "Dear Ruth," I simply began, "Today." And then, today I didn't wait for anyone. Today I walked without a destination. Today I smiled for no reason. The words flowed like warm water, honest, soft, unfiltered. I wrote about the smell of the house at noon, about the little trail of ants on the porch, about the sound of Max barking in the distance. Things that used to go unnoticed now felt like secret messages from life itself, whispering, "You are here, and that's enough." I paused for a while, rested my head on the back of the chair, closed my eyes. I could feel time like fabric being stitched together again, but this time by my own hands. No patterns, no old names, no fear. When I opened my eyes, I saw Walter walking by with Max. He raised his hand. I waved him in. It was the first time I invited him to come inside. We sat in the garden and talked like old friends. Walter shared stories from his youth, told me about the wife he had lost years ago, and how he had learned to find comfort in silence. I listened carefully, and at one point I said with a gentle smile, "You know, I spent my life waiting for someone who didn't even know I was waiting. And now, I'm giving myself the chance to see what exists beyond that." Walter didn't say anything. He just nodded, like someone who truly understands. And that was enough. As the sun went down, I returned to my notebook and added, "Today, I sat beside someone and didn't long for the past. I simply lived in the present." It was the beginning of autumn when I realized the old rosebush in the garden had never bloomed. I had cared for it out of habit, never really questioning why it stayed the same. But now, with my soul in motion, I decided it was time. I changed the soil, cut away the dead branches, and I spoke to the plant. the same way I'd been learning to speak to my heart. While trimming, I thought about all the times I'd done this with my own memories, leaving untouched things that no longer held life, just because I didn't know how to let them go. But this time, I pruned with purpose, not to forget, but to make room for something new. A few days later, I noticed the first signs of budding, small, shy, but they were there. I knelt beside the rose bush and smiled. It felt like I was blooming too, not young again, not naive, but whole, with all the marks and merits of someone who waited and then chose to begin again. That evening, Walter came by with Max. This time he didn't wait for an invitation. He brought a basket with slices of apple cake and 2 embroidered napkins. We sat on the porch. Max lay on the mat by the door like he belonged there. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. We simply existed together. And I realized it was the first time I felt this peace, to be with someone without needing to be anything else but myself. At one point, Walter looked at the rose bush and said, "Looks like someone here finally decided to live." I looked at him and replied, "She just needed space, and someone who didn't expect her to be like before." That night, I wrote in my notebook, "The rose didn't bloom for decades, but still, she tried. Maybe I'm just like her." I woke up with a quiet heart, as if something deep inside already knew the day would be different. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the birds louder than usual. I put on a light sweater, pinned a pearl clip into my hair, and sat at the table with a blank page in front of me. That morning, I decided to write the letter I had never written. Not to Frank, not to my mother, not to any old ghost, but to me, to the woman who had waited so long, who silenced her own wants, who hid behind memories. Dear Ruth, today I want to say I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every time you waited for love where there was only absence. I'm sorry for all the dances you didn't dance, all the polish you didn't wear, all the feelings you swallowed for fear of being too much. But I also want to thank you for staying, for holding on, even in silence. I paused at times to breathe, other times to smile with tearful eyes, and in the end, I wrote with steady hands, "You're alive, and finally, you're here. Welcome back." I folded the letter and placed it in the nightstand drawer. I knew I wouldn't need to read it again, because now every word was alive inside me. Later that day, I went downtown with Marion. We got ice cream, sat on a park bench, watched children run and fall and laugh. I didn't feel stuck in the past anymore. I was fully here, with a friend beside me, sweetness on my tongue, and a whole life still ahead of me. It was Sunday when I decided to take new photos for the picture frames around the house. For the first time in years, I wanted to capture the now. I asked Marion to take one of me on the porch, smiling, with the blue vase in the background, and when I saw the image on her camera screen, I whispered, "That's me. Finally." Later, I printed a copy and placed it beside the only photo I'd kept from my youth. The 2 Ruths stood side by side, the one who dreamed, and the one who chose to live. Neither was better, just whole in different times. Walter came by in the late afternoon. He brought mint tea, 2 cookies, and a smile. "I signed up for a watercolor class," he said. I raised my eyebrows, amused. I thought I was the only one reinventing life after 70. He laughed. "It's never too late to start anything." We sat in the garden, under the soft shade of the rose bush that now bloomed effortlessly. Max curled up at our feet, lazy and peaceful. I leaned back and looked up at the sky, where clouds drifted like thoughts that no longer hurt. There were no promises between Walter and me, no past to fix, just the present, and the present was enough. Before going to bed, I placed a new bookmark in my notebook. I wrote, "This is the story of a woman who waited, and one day chose to stop waiting, not to receive someone else's love, but to finally give herself the love she always deserved." I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and slept peacefully. The life, at last, was mine.